Hey everyone, Retro Tech Dad here, and what do you know, I've got something a bit unusual to show off this week. Now, as you can see, I've got a package here from Amazon that arrived earlier today, and so let's go ahead and quickly tear this box open and find out what's inside. Occasionally, I find myself going on a journey, browsing Amazon.com for all sorts of random tech finds, and so this time around, I was curious to see what was available as the cheapest option for a tablet that specifically ships with Windows, because I just like to torture myself apparently. So what we have here is a bit of a curiosity and something I was really not expecting to find in the vast sea of questionable tablets that were most certainly not Windows or x86 for that matter. It's truly amazing how many junky Android tablets are for sale under a certain price point on Amazon.com. Anyways, what I've got here is a tablet from Fujitsu, a very well-known brand especially in Japan, and a company that has been creating computers in very interesting form factors for a long time. I stumbled on this Fujitsu Stylistic Q5010 for a whopping $68. And not only is this a tablet, but it comes with a keyboard that the tablet can dock into and then turn it into a laptop. So, unexpectedly, I actually found something a little better than I was hoping for. Now, I did some research and it looks like this released towards the end of 2020, and so it is a few years old now, which partly explains the pricing. Now, talking about that pricing, we can't expect a whole lot, but what we do get here, as I mentioned, is a 2-in-1 touchscreen laptop that features a 10.1-inch display at a resolution of 1920 by 1200, which is actually nicer than expected. And on board, we've got the Intel Celeron N4020 with Intel UHD Graphics 600, a glacially slow processor meant for the most basic of tasks. But that doesn't mean we won't try to squeeze some gaming out of it, even if we have to engage our inner potato. This particular unit comes with 4GB of LPDDR4 RAM and a whopping 64GB of eMMC internal storage, which thankfully is not a huge deal as we have the ability to expand storage with the microSD slot that is built into this tablet. And we do have some ports to talk about, with a surprising inclusion of a full-size USB-A 3.0 port and even a USB Type-C port that does support video out and charging, even though this tablet also has a separate barrel jack power adapter that came with this unit for charging. Now, it's definitely nice to have this option to charge via USB-C in case you forget that power adapter. There's also a 3.5mm audio port here and what looks to be a space for a stylus, but this particular unit doesn't include one, and I'm not quite sure of its stylus capabilities. What's pretty cool about this tablet is that all the ports have covers to protect them from unwanted debris and dust, and just overall this tablet is very rugged and kind of reminds me of a mini Toughbook of sorts. Apparently, the chassis is made with a magnesium alloy and features shock-resistant construction, at least according to Fujitsu's marketing. Finally, this thing does have Windows 11 Pro out of the box, and I'm gonna just say it right now, but we will definitely be getting rid of that in favor of a lighter flavor of Windows, or perhaps a Linux distro, and I'm curious to hear what everyone's favorite operating system is for low-powered devices like this tablet down in the comments. So inside the box, we do get that power adapter I mentioned earlier, and this is such a tiny power adapter, which is definitely preferred since I've seen plenty of these that get obnoxiously large. These units, I guess, are refurbished, and this one was listed as an Amazon renewed product in excellent condition, and there's seemingly a bunch of these around the same price point available on Amazon. So I'm not sure if these were just quite popular overseas, but I'm not complaining since I don't mind the price on this. The laptop was nicely protected, and there's even an inspection sheet inside marking things off, so it does look like some care was put into the refurbishing process. This particular unit seems to be in decent shape, and wow, this is such an interesting combination with that keyboard and the 2-in-1 form factor. So you can see that the keyboard is made in Japan, and in fact, this entire unit is made in Japan, which is something you don't see much of anymore nowadays. The hinge on this is very strong, and it seems like it will not be a problem at all, and the whole unit in general just feels quite rugged and well made, and so it does seem to live up to Fujitsu's claims. The keyboard, as expected, is a bit cramped, and it's just okay to type on. Now, it's nice that it's included and actually docks with the tablet to make it feel like a complete unit, so it is nice to have in a pinch. The keyboard itself does have Japanese marking on it, but it's not a huge deal as the keyboard does have English characters and most of the functionality of a standard English keyboard, including the QWERTY layout. So let's separate the tablet from the keyboard, which lines up with my original goal of finding a Windows-based tablet for as cheap as possible on Amazon. There's a specific mechanism for this built into the keyboard which unlocks the tablet and lets it free. The tablet on its own is surprisingly lighter than I expected, so the keyboard base is definitely adding a good amount of weight, which I think most of it is actually in that hinge. since it's actually quite stable and doesn't seem to have an issue falling backwards when it's in that keyboard dock. On the back, we can see that the tablet is also made in Japan, and of course we've got Intel inside as well as Windows. Now, I did some research and there were some models of this Fujitsu that also had a fingerprint reader on the back. Now, this particular one doesn't, and so there's a plastic cap over where it would normally be. Okay, so let's try powering this on and see what we get out of the box with the operating system. Now, I suspect this is probably going to need a charge, and yeah, it doesn't seem to be turning on. So before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and just quickly give this a nice rub down and clean it up with a wipe, since this is a secondhand unit and it's amazing just how much dirt actually gets cleaned off. I will say that this is in pretty nice condition overall, but I imagine it is very much the luck of the draw given that these are refurbished and available from multiple sellers. So of course, I can't help myself, and I think it's time to do a quick teardown just to see what's going on under the hood, and I guess it's time to grab my trusty iFixit kit, and for right now, all we need is a pick to separate the back plate from the tablet. It's pretty easy to get this wedge in here, and basically just go slowly around the entirety of the tablet, which will separate from the rest of it. There are some tabs that go in the opposite direction, if that makes any sense, and they will require putting force with the pick in the opposite way. Okay, with all of that, the back plate is off, and boy, this is a really flimsy piece of plastic, which is funny because the rest of the unit is actually quite rigid. We can also very clearly see where that fingerprint reader was meant to go with this off. Okay, so now peeking at the back of the tablet with the back cover off, I've never quite seen this before, but there's actually a clear plastic film over almost the entirety of the unit. And I imagine it's for the IP52 rating that Fujitsu claims it has, and so I'm just going to be reckless and tear it off. That film only reveals yet another piece of film, which appears to be over the processor and battery, at least that's what I'm assuming here. So let me go ahead and peel this off, which is much easier to get off, and as I suspected, we've got the battery and the heatsink for the processor under what appears to be a plastic cage. The battery is pretty easy to access and comes out with the removal of 3 screws and then 1 cable that can be disconnected without the need to remove anything else. The battery looks like it's in good shape, and I will verify the health once we're in the OS, and it's worth noting that this is a 31 watt-hour or 4250 milliamp hour battery, so it's not a very high capacity battery, which makes sense paired with the low-powered N4020. So the rest of this unit is protected in a plastic cage with screws that go around the entirety of the tablet. There's seriously a bunch of screws here in place. I didn't want to remove the cage as it does seem to be held down fairly well even with the screws removed, and I was worried about damaging the display by removing it. I will say that the metal bracket for the hinge is incredibly solid. Not only is it fully metal, but those screws are seriously in place, and I can see why the hinge with the keyboard component feels very strong structurally. So let's quickly put this all back together and enjoy ourselves a soothing time lapse. Alright, with that, I'm going to go ahead and grab the power adapter and let this charge a bit, and then we'll just check up on it in just a moment.
3 hours later.
Hey, we've got power. What do you know? A Windows 11 Pro setup waiting for me. And boy, do I just love going through these. So for the sake of what I'm doing here, I'm just going to do a local account, which you can still do in Windows 11. There's a few methods, but the one that works for me is opening up a command prompt by pressing Shift and F10 on the network screen and then entering the command start ms-cxh and local only, and bada bing bada boom, we skip most of the junk and now we're in the Windows desktop. I mostly wanted to do this because, as I said, I'm pretty sure we're gonna nuke this OS, and put something a bit more lightweight, since Windows 11 Pro on an Intel Celeron N4020 sounds like a terrible time, and as much as I love torturing myself with underpowered hardware, this is not the way I prefer to do it. I will say that it's a pretty clean install with just the usual Microsoft junk on here. So right before I did that, I wanted to run Half-Life 2 really quick, and so I did set up Steam, update the Intel drivers, and just a few other things before I launched Half-Life 2 so that I could get a sense of where we're at with performance. Unfortunately, I had my camera poorly positioned for this, and I do apologize for that, so the frame rate isn't as visible as I'd like, but I will say it was just an okay experience, and I do think we could do a little better, and so with that, I think we're ready to move on from here. Now, behind the scenes, I did further testing and went through various Linux distros as well as Tiny 11, but I found that just going with a really lightweight build of Windows 10 would be a solid fit for the specific tablet, because of some issues with the display, and this is actually not a native landscape display, so when we're in setup for all of these various operating systems, you will see that we are in the portrait orientation. Now this posed a problem for some of the Linux distros during actual setup, and I had to get creative, so in terms of the least painful, I decided to go with the Windows 10 build of Atlas OS that I had around on a USB drive. I like this version of Atlas OS since it gets the RAM usage down to about 900 megabytes with it, which is critical for a device that only has 4 gigabytes of RAM in total. I also wanted to show off what is offered in the BIOS, and there's not a whole lot of options here, which I expected. And to get into the BIOS, it's actually pretty straightforward. You just hold down the volume down button and then power on the device and keep holding the volume down until you hear the chime, and then you can let go. Now you'll notice that the BIOS is in Japanese, and it's actually easier to change into English than I expected, and I probably could have done without the use of Google Translate, but basically you just go over one tab and then scroll down to the bottom, and the only other option for the language is English. There are some interesting things here, and we do have some options for the CPU, but it's quite limited, and really with a Celeron processor, there's not much we're going to really be able to get out of it. And so with Atlas OS ready to go, I will just say that everything here feels so much faster and all the drivers are actually working out of the box. It didn't really require much in the way of additional setup once in the desktop, and of course I got everything prepped for what the ultimate goal of this video is, which is to see what we can squeeze out of this in terms of gaming. There's probably not much doubt that we won't be doing a whole lot of PC gaming on this, at least when talking about games that have released in the past decade, outside of the absolute, and I mean absolute lightest experiences. But I love potato PCs and potato gaming, and really who doesn't love potatoes? So first off, can it run Doom? Well, yeah, of course it can. I mean, if Doom can run on a pregnancy test, it should run just fine on this $68 computer, and so that it does. Now for a more serious test, let's travel back in time a little bit, and the first game that came to mind that's always fun to load up and see running on absolutely low power hardware like this is Half-Life 2. And amazingly, it runs, especially once you turn down all of the settings, and I'm just running the game here at 1280 by 800 to maintain the 16:10 aspect ratio, and this seems to be solid enough with frame rate staying above 30, and if you want to reminisce or are curious about how that original Xbox port of this game looked like, this is a pretty close replica of that experience. I will say that this is also much smoother than the initial experience I had with the original install of a Windows 11 Pro, and the game is even managing frame rates over 60, which is a pleasant surprise. You also might have noticed that I'm using a telescopic controller, at least to showcase Half-Life 2, and for those that are longtime viewers of the channel know that I love my tablets and telescopic controllers. And for this one I actually struggled to find a decent solution since the USB-C port is tucked away inside the tablet, which makes a USB-C controller a bit tricky, and the placement is also right in the center where I'd want to keep a telescopic controller attached, but I did scrounge through my bin of controllers and found this BSP D9 that looks like we have a PlayStation Portal at home. And hey, it works, so at least there's that. Now I did say the absolute lightest of more current and modern games are run on this, and I had some good luck with a lot of the .emu games like Marvel's Cosmic Invasion and TMNT's Shredder's Revenge. And so games along those lines should do okay here. But again, don't expect miracles with a Celeron chip from a few years ago. And considering what I paid for this, I'm actually a little surprised in a good way. The thing for me, at least when looking at the specs and capabilities of a computer like this, is to approach your gaming a little differently. And there's so many great older PC games that will run very well on this setup. And so if anything, it's an opportunity to revisit older favorites or perhaps tackle that mile-long backlog of great games. And really, this is where it gets fun for me, at least as there's so much that opens up when you shift your mindset and embrace older games. I've experimented with some personal favorites like Burnout Paradise, Geometry Wars 3, the PC version of Outrun 2006, and so many of the older Need for Speed games like Carbon, Underground, and Most Wanted 2005 will all run pretty well here. So for a $68 tablet PC, I guess it's not too bad, and it's about what I expected given the chipset. Now since this is a tablet PC, I did check out a few games that work well with just a touchscreen and using it just as a tablet, and it's been pretty fun with something like Bloons TD5 and 6. The same goes for some Tate mode gaming, and since we're on a Windows device, I can actually check out some of the more interesting vertical shmups with this setup and make use of the tablet in the vertical orientation. I'll be doing this again in just a moment when I talk about emulation. You know what? Let's just go right ahead and do just that. Now, surprisingly, this thing is decently capable for emulation, and unlike last week's video where I explored a 10-year-old Razer laptop that could handle high-end emulation, this humble tablet won't exactly be running things like PlayStation 3 or even Nintendo Switch. But it can do more than one might think, and we could definitely test out what I'd consider mid-range emulation, so platforms like GameCube with the Dolphin emulator, and PlayStation 2 with PCSX2, as well as PlayStation Portable with PPSSPP, which runs on almost anything nowadays. For PlayStation 2, as you might imagine, the absolute lightest of games will do the best here, and so you can forget about most of the heavy hitters without relying on heavy tweaking or drops in resolution, which just compromise the gaming experience a bit too much for me personally. Now, GameCube with Dolphin will fare a little better than PlayStation 2 emulation using this setup, but again, I'd say that lighter GameCube games overall will be the target, and definitely things like using PAL region games will help squeeze just a little bit more out of the device. There's no doubt that slightly heavier games compared to PS2 will be playable here, like Wave Race Blue Storm, which runs quite well. By the way, I did experiment a little bit, and I found that an older build of Dolphin did work better with this underpowered tablet, so it's always worth exploring older builds when dealing with low-powered or even older hardware. And I did mention that PlayStation Portable will be pretty solid here as well, outside of the absolute heaviest games for the platform, but even then with some tweaks or hacks, a good portion of the PSP library will run just fine on this tablet, and in some cases, we can get away with some upscaling. For example, games like Ridge Racer here, which is upscaled to 2x and runs pretty well. The reality is that when it comes to emulation, I'd say things like PlayStation 1, Dreamcast, and older, this tablet will handle a lot of those platforms without much trouble. Finally, I did say that I had another use for that vertical orientation, and yes, I did test out some Nintendo DS emulation, and this tablet does a solid job, and I do like the vertical orientation for DS games specifically, since we can get the two large screens stacked on each other, and since we've got a touchscreen as well, it's great for some of the less demanding touchscreen input games like Electroplankton and Yoshi's Touch and Go. So with all of that, this was a fun experiment and curiosity that is weirdly decent. Ultimately, with some love and maybe a different mindset, you could do quite a bit with this combination that costs only $68, and certainly there's much worse out there for the money. I don't think it's going to blow anyone away, but it's certainly better than the vast amount of junky Android tablets I found on Amazon for a similar price, and for light tasks will actually do alright. Now I'm curious to hear what you think in the comments section, and I've actually been having a lot of fun looking at older tech, and I might have some older stuff coming up on the channel, so definitely keep an eye out. I hope you enjoyed watching me explore this budget tablet. Until the next video, as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.